Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we delve into heartfelt tales of resilience, compassion, and transformation. Today's story takes us to Brookhaven Heights, a seemingly perfect suburban neighborhood hiding deep-seated prejudice. Join us as we follow Sophia Carter's journey from injustice to redemption, proving the power of courage and community. Sophia Carter pulled her car into the driveway of her new home on Birchwood Lane. It was a warm summer afternoon, and the sun bathed the perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences in a golden glow. The neighborhood seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a magazine ad. For Sophia, it was a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the noise and chaos of the city and find peace in a quieter, more serene place. Her house was modest but charming, a white colonial with blue shutters and a small garden in the front yard. Sophia had fallen in love with it the moment she saw it. It was a place she could call her own, where she could rebuild her life after years of living in the shadows of others' expectations. She stepped out of the car, stretching her back after the long drive, and glanced around at her surroundings. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. There were no children playing on the lawns, no neighbors chatting on their porches. It felt like the entire neighborhood was watching her, unseen eyes peering out from behind perfectly drawn curtains. Sophia shook off the unease that crept up her spine and told herself it was just nerves. Moving to a new place was always a little intimidating. She reasoned, people just needed time to warm up. The moving truck arrived shortly after, and Sophia got to work unloading her belongings. As she carried a box up the steps, she noticed a flicker of movement in the window across the street. A curtain fell back into place just as quickly as it had moved. She smiled and waved, hoping to catch the attention of whoever was behind it, but there was no response. By the time the truck drove away, the sun was beginning to set, and Sophia was exhausted. She sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, surveying her new domain. Despite the strange silence of the neighborhood, she felt a spark of hope. This was her chance to start fresh, to build a life that was truly hers. She resolved to make an effort to connect with her neighbors. Surely, they would come around once they got to know her. The next morning, Sophia decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The houses on Birchwood Lane were nearly identical, with neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds that seemed to be in competition for the most vibrant blooms. It was beautiful, but unsettling in its uniformity. Sophia greeted the few people she passed with a cheerful "good morning," but was met with polite nods and tight-lipped smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. As she rounded the corner back to her house, she spotted a woman walking a small dog. The woman was middle-aged, with meticulously styled blonde hair and a sharp, tailored outfit that seemed more suited for a boardroom than a casual stroll. Sophia seized the opportunity to introduce herself. "Hi there," she called out with a bright smile. "I'm Sophia Carter. I just moved in down the street." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on the dog's leash. "Oh, hello," she said after a moment, her tone carefully neutral. "Margaret Harper. It's nice to meet you." "Margaret, this neighborhood is lovely. I'm really excited to be here," Sophia said, trying to sound enthusiastic despite the cool reception. Margaret's lips curled into what might have been a smile, though it lacked any warmth. "Yes, well, we don't see a lot of new faces around here," she said, her gaze sweeping over Sophia in a way that felt more evaluative than welcoming. "Especially not ones like yours." Sophia's heart sank. The implication was clear, but she forced herself to keep smiling. "Well, I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone," she said evenly. Margaret nodded curtly and walked away, her dog trotting beside her. Sophia watched her go, the sting of the encounter lingering long after Margaret had disappeared from view. She had hoped for a warm welcome, or at least a neutral one. Instead, she had been met with veiled hostility. She reminded herself that Margaret was just one person. The rest of the neighborhood couldn't all be like that, could they? Over the next few days, Sophia threw herself into settling in. She unpacked her boxes, rearranged furniture, and added personal touches to the house. Each evening, she sat on her porch, hoping to catch a glimpse of her neighbors or maybe strike up a conversation. But the street remained unnervingly quiet. It was as if the entire neighborhood had conspired to avoid her. By the end of the week, Sophia decided she needed to take a more proactive approach. If her neighbors wouldn't come to her, she would go to them. She spent an afternoon baking her grandmother's famous chocolate chip cookies, the sweet aroma filling her kitchen and lifting her spirits. Once the cookies were cooled and arranged in a decorative tin, she set out to deliver them. Her first stop was Margaret's house. Sophia stood on the porch, her heart pounding as she rang the doorbell. Long moments passed, and she was about to turn away when the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, her expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Sophia said, forcing a smile. "I wanted to bring you these as a thank you for being my first neighbor to say hello." Margaret glanced at the tin of cookies, her brow furrowing slightly. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She didn't reach out to take the tin. Sophia hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "There's just a little something to say. I'm happy to be here," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I hope we can get to know each other." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might say something kind. Instead, she stepped back and said, "Thank you. Have a nice day." She closed the door, leaving Sophia standing on the porch, holding the cookies. As Sophia made her way back to her house, her optimism began to wane. It wasn't just Margaret. Every neighbor she approached had offered polite but distant responses, their smiles never reaching their eyes. The community she had hoped would embrace her felt more like a fortress she would never be allowed to enter. That night, as Sophia lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of the week's events pressed down on her. She had moved to Brookhaven Heights with hope in her heart, ready to build a life of connection and belonging. Instead, she felt more isolated than ever. She resolved to keep trying, to not let the coldness of her neighbors extinguish her spirit. But deep down, a seed of doubt had taken root. Was it possible to find community in a place that didn't want her? Could kindness and determination break through walls built on prejudice and fear? Sophia didn't know the answers yet, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The morning was crisp and bright, a perfect day in Brookhaven Heights. Sophia decided to spend it tending to her small garden. The vibrant blooms and neat rows of shrubs she had planted were her attempt to fit into the neighborhood's pristine aesthetic. Gardening offered her solace, a way to reclaim a sense of control after the chilly reception she'd received. As she worked, she noticed the occasional glance from neighbors walking by, but no one stopped to chat or even offer a friendly wave. Later that afternoon, Sophia decided to deliver another round of cookies. She'd baked a fresh batch the night before, hoping to mend fences and create some goodwill. She carried a tray of them next door to Margaret Harper's house, determined to bridge the gap between them. This time, when Margaret answered the door, her expression was tighter than before. Sophia greeted her warmly, holding out the plate of cookies. "Hi, Margaret. I thought I'd bring these by as a neighborly gesture. I hope you enjoy them." Margaret eyed the cookies with a look that was impossible to read. After a long pause, she took them with a curt nod. "Thank you," she said, her tone lacking any genuine warmth. Then, without another word, she closed the door. Sophia walked away, feeling deflated but still hopeful that this small act might soften Margaret's heart. She had no idea the storm that was brewing behind that closed door. 15 minutes later, as Sophia sat at her kitchen table sipping tea, there was a loud, insistent knock at her door. Startled, she set down her cup and hurried to answer it. Standing on her porch were two uniformed police officers, their faces grim. "Miss Carter?" one of them asked. "Yes," she replied, her voice laced with confusion. "Can I help you?" "We've received a report from your neighbor, Margaret Harper," the officer said, his tone professional but firm. "She claims you attempted to harm her by delivering poisoned cookies." Sophia's stomach dropped. "What?" she gasped, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "That's impossible. I just baked those cookies as a kind gesture." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. "Miss Harper provided us with evidence," the second officer said, holding up a plastic bag containing what looked like a few crumbs and small, pale granules. "She claims to have found these in the cookies." Sophia stared at the bag, her heart pounding. That's ridiculous. I didn't put anything in those cookies. They're just chocolate chip. Please. You have to believe me. Miss Carter. The first officer interrupted, his voice steady but unyielding. We're going to need you to come with us for questioning. Sophia's mind raced as panic set in. Wait, she stammered. You don't understand. This is a mistake. Why would I try to harm anyone? I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. But her protest fell on deaf ears. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Please turn around, he instructed. Sophia's hands shook as she complied, the cold metal biting into her wrists. The humiliation was almost unbearable. She glanced around, only to see curtains twitching and doors cracking open. Neighbors stood on their porches, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Margaret Harper watched from her porch, her arms crossed and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. As Sophia was led to the waiting patrol car, shame and disbelief washed over her. She had come to Brookhaven Heights to find peace and community. Now, she was being paraded through the neighborhood like a criminal. The place she had hoped to call home had turned into a nightmare. The ride to the police station was a blur. Sophia's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. How could Margaret accuse her of such a terrible act? And why would the police believe her without any real evidence? The walls seemed to close in around her as she was led into the station, her pleas of innocence ignored. Inside a small, sterile interrogation room, the officers began their questioning. They placed a bag of crumbs and granules on the table in front of her. Miss Carter, one officer began, his tone clipped. Can you explain how this substance ended up in the cookies you delivered? Sophia leaned forward, her voice trembling. I don't know what that is, she said, but I can assure you it didn't come from me. I've never owned anything like rat poison, and I would never harm anyone. Miss Harper claims she found a bottle of rat poison in your garden shed, the other officer added. Sophia's eyes widened in shock. That's impossible. I haven't even unpacked half my things yet. My shed is practically empty. You can check it yourselves. The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. We'll investigate further, one of them said. But for now, you'll need to remain in custody. As they left her alone in the room, Sophia buried her face in her hands. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a physical burden. How could this have happened? What had she done to deserve such animosity? Hours later, as she sat in a holding cell, Sophia replayed the events in her mind. Margaret's cold reception, the suspicious looks from neighbors, the refusal to engage with her attempts at kindness. It all pointed to something deeper, something far more insidious than a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't just about cookies. It was about who she was and the fact that she didn't fit into the carefully curated image of Brookhaven Heights. As the night wore on, Sophia's despair began to give way to a simmering determination. She would prove her innocence. She would expose the truth behind Margaret's actions and the prejudice lurking beneath the pristine facade of the neighborhood. Whatever it took, she would fight back. For now, though, all she could do was wait, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The following morning, Sophia Carter was released from custody with instructions to remain available for further questioning. Her steps were heavy as she left the police station, her heart weighed down by the humiliation and uncertainty of the previous day. She knew that even though she was out of the holding cell, she was still far from free. The accusation had left a stain on her reputation, and the neighbors who already viewed her with suspicion would only see her as guilty. As she walked up the driveway of her home in Brookhaven Heights, Sophia noticed a few neighbors peeking from behind curtains or stepping out onto their porches to watch her. Their silent judgment was palpable. Margaret Harper stood on her porch, her expression smug and satisfied. Sophia held her head high, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Inside, Sophia sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing with thoughts of how to clear her name. She couldn't let this accusation define her or force her out of the neighborhood. She had come to Brookhaven Heights for a new beginning, and she wasn't going to let prejudice and lies take that away from her. But where would she even begin? That afternoon, a knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found Claire Rivers, one of the few neighbors who had been cordial since Sophia moved in. Claire's face was flushed, her expression conflicted. "Hi, Sophia." Claire began hesitantly. "Can I come in? I think we need to talk." Sophia stepped aside, gesturing for Claire to enter. Once inside, Claire wasted no time. "I want you to know that I don't believe what Margaret's saying about you," she said, her voice firm. "I've known Margaret for years, and this isn't the first time she's caused trouble for someone new in the neighborhood." Sophia's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she asked. Claire sighed, glancing down at her hands. "Margaret has a history of targeting people who don't fit her idea of what Brookhaven Heights should look like. She's done this before, making baseless accusations, spreading rumors, driving people out. It's always subtle enough that she doesn't face any real consequences. But it's effective." Sophia felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger at Margaret's malice, but relief that someone in the neighborhood was willing to speak up. "Why hasn't anyone stopped her?" she asked. Claire hesitated. "Honestly, a lot of people agree with her, or at least they don't want to cross her. She's been here forever, and she has a way of making people fall in line. But what she's done to you, it's gone too far." Sophia leaned forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "Will you help me expose the truth, Claire? If she's done this before, we need to bring it to light. She can't keep getting away with this." Claire nodded. "I'll help you, and I think I know where we can start." Over the next few days, Claire and Sophia worked together, digging into Margaret's past actions. They combed through neighborhood records, spoke to former residents, and uncovered a disturbing pattern. Margaret had used her influence to make life unbearable for several families, particularly those who didn't fit the mold of Brookhaven Heights. Complaints about noise, fabricated accusations, and relentless gossip had driven many to leave. One evening, as they pored over old HOA records in Claire's living room, they found their smoking gun, a series of emails Margaret had sent to other HOA members, discussing ways to maintain the character of the neighborhood. The language was coded, but the intent was clear. Margaret wanted to exclude anyone who didn't conform to her narrow vision of who belonged in Brookhaven Heights. "This is it," Claire said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and determination. "This proves she's been targeting people." Sophia nodded, her own resolve hardening. "It's not just about me anymore," she said. "This is about everyone she's hurt. We need to take this to the HOA and the police." The next HOA meeting was a tense affair. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her demeanor imperious as she called the meeting to order. But as Sophia and Claire presented their findings, the atmosphere shifted. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as the emails were read aloud. For the first time, Margaret looked genuinely unsettled. "I don't know what you're trying to suggest," Margaret said, her voice cold but shaky. "But I've always acted in the best interest of this community." Sophia stood, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "No, Margaret, you've acted in your own interest, at the expense of others. You've used your power to harm people, to push them out simply because they didn't meet your standards. It ends now." The room fell silent. The other HOA members looked at one another, their expressions a mix of shock and shame. Finally, one of them spoke. "We need to investigate this further," she said. "If what Sophia and Claire are saying is true, we can't let it continue." Margaret's veneer of composure cracked. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed. "I won't stand for these baseless accusations." But the evidence was undeniable. Within days, the HOA announced that Margaret would be removed from her position and that an independent review of past complaints would be conducted. The police, too, began investigating Margaret's actions, including the false accusation against Sophia. As the truth came to light, the atmosphere in Brookhaven Heights began to shift. Neighbors who had previously avoided Sophia started reaching out, offering apologies and support. A few even admitted that they had been intimidated by Margaret and were relieved to see her influence waning. For Sophia, it was a bittersweet victory. The scars of what she had endured wouldn't fade overnight, but she felt a sense of hope for the first time since moving to the neighborhood. With Claire's encouragement, She decided to stay and continue building the community she had dreamed of when she first arrived. Over the next few months, Sophia became a vocal advocate for inclusivity in Brookhaven Heights. She helped organize neighborhood events, worked with the restructured HOA to create fair policies, and reached out to families who had been pushed out, inviting them to return. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to transform. On a sunny afternoon, as Sophia baked another batch of cookies, this time for a community picnic, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. Brookhaven Heights still had its flaws, but it was changing for the better, and Sophia knew she had played a part in that change. As she placed the cookies on a tray, ready to share them with her neighbors, she smiled. This time, the gesture wouldn't be met with suspicion or malice. It would be met with the warmth and community she had always hoped to find. And that made all the difference. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through Sophia Carter's fight for truth and acceptance in Brookhaven Heights. If this story inspired you, we invite you to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't miss our next tale of hope and resilience. Click here to watch another empowering story. Together, let's continue spreading empathy and understanding.